Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is always to take these dense, fascinating sources, research papers, historical accounts, all that specialized stuff, and really pull out the essential knowledge for you. We want to give you that comprehensive understanding, but without the information overload. Today, we're digging deep into one of the most, frankly, astonishing stories of national endurance from the 13th century, the Mongol invasions of Goryeo, the ancient kingdom of Korea. Okay, let's try and unpack this a bit. When we think about the Mongol Empire, the story is usually one of just swift, devastating conquest, right? Central Asia, Eastern Europe, huge empires just shattered, often really quickly. But when you look at how Goryeo reacted to the Great Khan's armies, this phrase keeps popping up in the sources, stubborn resistance. And we're not talking about a single battle here. This was a drawn-out conflict almost 4 decades, from 1231 right up to 1270, 9 major invasions. So the core question, really, the paradox we need to explore based on these sources is how? How did this relatively small kingdom, Goryeo, manage to withstand that relentless pressure? How did they avoid the kind of total annihilation that so many others faced?
It's fascinating, isn't it? The sheer length of it, 40 years of essentially attrition warfare that became Goryeo's, well, its greatest weapon in a strange way. It wasn't about winning a decisive battle. It was fundamentally about preventing a decisive loss. Our sources, they meticulously lay out the timeline, invasion by invasion. But what's really revealing is the defense strategies Goryeo came up with. Some were surprisingly desperate, others quite ingenious. And they really changed the game in terms of medieval warfare in East Asia at the time. The outcome wasn't a military victory in the traditional sense. It was survival, achieved through what you might call strategic non-conquest. And eventually this led to Goryeo becoming a vassal state of the Yuan dynasty for about 80 years.
Right, so our mission today is to trace that history, pinpoint those critical moments, the battles, the shifts in strategy, and really understand the huge impact this period had, both inside Goryeo and on the wider Mongol world across Eurasia. And to really grasp the devastation that came later, we have to start where the sources say it began, with this sort of accidental first contact, not planned conquest at all.
Exactly. You can't understand the 9 invasions without going back almost 20 years before the first formal campaign. We're talking about the period between roughly 1216 and 1225. The relationship then was messy, driven by political necessity, not some grand Mongol plan to conquer Korea.
Yeah, this is where the geopolitics gets really tangled. Korea first bumps into the Mongols, not as invaders targeting them, but because the Mongols were chasing their own enemies, and that chase just sort of spilled over onto the peninsula.
Yeah.
The catalyst here were the Khitan people.
Right, the Khitans. Historically powerful, but by this point they were fractured. The Jin dynasty had risen, then the Mongols were becoming dominant. So by 1216, you have this large group of Khitan rebels fleeing Mongol power, fleeing this new state called Eastern Jia that had popped up on the border. They were desperate, and when Goryeo refused to help them or let them pass through, well, desperation took over. Something like 90,000 Khitan men crossed the Yalu River into Goryeo territory.
90,000 people. I mean, that's not a raiding party. That's a migrating crisis. It's hugely destabilizing. And they immediately started pillaging southwards, didn't they?
They did. Goryeo had to fight them for about 2 years. Eventually, a Goryeo general, Kim Shwiri, managed to push them back towards those volatile borderlands. And that's where the Mongols were already operating. This instability basically forced the two powers into direct contact.
Into a kind of temporary, very uneasy alliance.
That's exactly it. In the winter of 1218, Mongol forces, maybe 10,000 troops under commanders Hazan and Zala, they entered Goryeo. And crucially, they were allied with about 20,000 troops from the eastern Jurchens. Together, they helped Goryeo corner and finally defeat the last of these Khitan rebels at Kangdong early in 1219. The sources mention over 50,000 Khitans surrendering there.
So, on the surface, Goryeo benefits, right? They get rid of this massive Khitan problem with Mongol help. But the sources point to immediate red flags, huge ones.
Oh, absolutely. Hazan, the Mongol commander, he didn't treat Goryeo like an equal partner who'd just helped him out. Not at all. He immediately demanded what they called an elder-younger brother relationship.
Which, in diplomatic speak, means Goryeo is instantly the junior partner, the subservient one.
Precisely. And it wasn't just words. When the Mongols withdrew, they seized a large number of Goryeo horses. Tribute, basically, demanded on the spot.
And they didn't just take stuff and leave, did they? They left people behind.
That's the key point. They left behind 41 administrative officials, these Doragachi, stationed in a place called Poju. Their job wasn't just collecting annual tribute payments. It was about learning the language, embedding themselves, making sure Goryeo followed Mongol orders. Their very presence was a symbol of imposed political weight. A constant reminder.
And Goryeo wasn't happy about this.
Yeah.
The sources say pretty clearly that within just a couple of years, King Gojong and his court were already talking about stopping the tribute, planning to resist somehow. It was humiliating, and it was economically draining.
Yeah, the resentment was building fast. And the spark that finally lit the fuse came in 1224. You had this Mongol delegation, including an official named Zuguyu, overseeing the latest tribute transfer. And get this detail, they reportedly took only the most valuable items, the otter pelts, and just discarded the rest. Shows you what the Mongols prioritized luxury goods for the empire. Anyway, while they were crossing the Yalu River on their way back, this delegation was attacked and killed by bandits.
By bandits. But the Mongols didn't buy that, did they?
Not for a second. They immediately suspected Goryeo was either complicit or had arranged the whole thing. They saw it as Goryeo trying to cut off the tribute relationship by force. So that led to the formal end of diplomatic relations in early 1225.
And Goryeo basically doubled down by refusing a subsequent Mongol order to help them attack the nearby eastern Xia state. So the lines were drawn. War was pretty much inevitable.
And when it came hard and fast. August 1231. That brings us to the first wave of invasions. And this is where Goryeo got a brutal lesson. Their traditional army, their conventional tactics, were just completely outmatched by the Mongol war machine.
This phase is so critical because you see that initial failure, but then you also see this incredibly drastic, almost desperate strategic pivot. And that was driven by the military dictator at the time, Choyu.
Absolutely. The first invasion was commanded by Saratai. He crossed the Yalu, and the initial Mongol sweep through the northwest was devastatingly quick.
And I had help from inside Goryeo, right? That defector.
Yes, that was crucial early on. A prominent figure named Hong Pokwen, he defected. He submitted his territory and around 1,500 households under his control directly to the Mongols. His family became invaluable guides for the invaders later, using their local knowledge against their own kingdom. It was a huge blow.
That pattern of using defectors is classic Mongol strategy. But even with that help, Goryeo didn't just roll over. There were pockets of fierce resistance.
Oh, definitely. The western capital, Pyongyang, put up a really stiff fight. Interestingly, it was reportedly led by an army composed mainly of slaves, under a commander named Ji Guangsu. They fought literally to the death.
But the standout story, the one that even the Mongols seem to have noted, was the Siege of Kuju.
Ah, Kuju, yes. Defended by Pak Sud and Kim Kyeong-sin, this siege became legendary. It's like a textbook case of how to defend against a state-of-the-art medieval siege. The Mongols threw everything they had at it. Sources mention 15 large catapults, huge siege towers built on carts.
The standard Mongol playbook. Mining under the walls, too.
Yeah, they tried mining tunnels beneath the walls. But the defenders at Kuju were just brilliant. They countered every move. They poured molten iron down onto the siege engines, setting them ablaze. When the Mongols mined, the Goryeo soldiers dug counter tunnels and managed to collapse the Mongol ones, sometimes trapping the miners inside.
Incredible ingenuity under pressure. They fought back offensively, too, didn't they?
They did. They used their own catapults, not just defensively, but to target the Mongol artillery positions. Pak Sud, the commander, even led successful sorties out of the city, hitting the Mongol lines directly. It showed incredible courage, not just passive defense. They held out for 40 days.
40 days against a full Mongol siege army. That's remarkable. Why did they eventually submit?
Only because they received direct formal orders from the Goryeo royal court. The king essentially ordered them to surrender to prevent the Mongols from just completely devastating the surrounding countryside in retaliation. It was a strategic sacrifice.
And it's telling that the sources say the Mongols actually admired the bravery of Pak Sud and another defender, Choijmi Chaju. They spared their lives, which wasn't always the Mongol way.
True. But despite these pockets of heroism, Goryeo as a whole was forced to submit again. They agreed to pay this enormous tribute, thousands of horses, tens of thousands of otter skins, you name it. But crucially, they still refused the demand for royal hostages. So when Saratai withdrew early in 1232, he left behind even more administrators this time. 72 Duragachi spread across the key provinces, really trying to cement Mongol control.
But that control lasted, what, a few months? Because this brings us to maybe the single most controversial and arguably decisive strategic decision of the entire 40-year conflict, the capital relocation.
Exactly. Choyu, the military dictator, he looked at the situation after that first invasion and realized, trying to defend the capital Kaesong out on the open plains, it was suicide. Conventional defense wasn't working. So in June 1232, he makes this incredibly radical call. Move the entire royal court, the whole government apparatus, from Kaesong to Gangwon Island just off the coast.
An island fortress, essentially. But this wasn't popular, was it? The sources mentioned dissent?
Hugely unpopular with some. It was so controversial that one high-ranking official, Kim Se-chung, who argued against it, was apparently executed immediately. This wasn't just moving the palace, it was a fundamental shift in national strategy. It was basically saying, we abandon the mainland plains to the invaders.
So what was the strategic thinking behind it, beyond just saving the elite?
Well, the justification was pretty ruthless but clear. The new policy, which stayed in place for the rest of the Cho military rule, wasn't just about the court moving. They instructed the entire population as much as possible to evacuate the plains and seek refuge either in fortified mountain citadels or on other coastal islands. The goal was twofold. One, protect the people from being immediately captured or killed by Mongol raids. Two, and this is critical, safeguard the tax base. You need people farming and producing goods to fund a long-term resistance. Gangwa itself was heavily fortified, hard to access by sea, and the fact is the Mongols never managed to conquer it.
But that raises a huge question, doesn't it? Was moving to Ganwa a stroke of genius that saved the dynasty? Or was it, kind of cowardly? The elite saving themselves while abandoning the majority of the population on the mainland to face the Mongol raids.
That's the central debate historians have about this period. From a pure military survival perspective, for the regime, it was brilliant. The Mongols were masters of cavalry on open ground and siege warfare against cities. They were notoriously bad at naval assaults and rooting out small, dug-in garrisons in rugged mountains. Gangwa played to Goryeo strengths and Mongol weaknesses. But you're absolutely right about the cost. It was an explicit abandonment of the mainland population. The Cho dictatorship preserved the state, the idea of Goryeo, but at the direct and terrible expense of the people living on the plains who suffered through decades of horrific raiding.
And the ultimate signal that this wasn't just a temporary retreat but renewed defiance came right after the move, didn't it?
It did. In the summer of 1232, Goryeo forces killed all 72 of those Mongol Darugachis who had been left on the mainland. That was throwing down the gauntlet. It was a calculated declaration. The war is back on.
And the Mongol response was immediate. Reprisal.
Floofed and brutal. Saratai turned his army right back around. This is the second invasion. He advanced south, deep into the Han River Valley, heading towards the new island capital. But then, something completely unexpected happened at a place called Chinsong.
This is one of those moments in history that just feels improbable. Saratai, the seemingly invincible Mongol commander leading the invasion,
Was killed, hit by a single arrow. And the sources say the shot came from a Buddhist monk named Kim Yunhu, who was helping with the defense.
just like that, the commander goes down,
And the entire Mongol army just retreat immediately. It wasn't that they'd lost the battle militarily, they likely still had the advantage. But losing their supreme commander in such a sudden, shocking way completely disrupted their campaign, their morale. It was catastrophic for their command structure.
So the death of one man basically ended the second invasion.
Pretty much. It bought Goryeo crucial breathing room, a few years of respite. And psychologically, it was huge. It framed the resistance as maybe having some kind of divine favor. The Mongols didn't completely leave the northwest, though. They maintained a presence through that defector, Han Pakwin, effectively appointing him as ruler of that region.
So Goryeo gets a pause, but everyone knew the Mongols would be back. This brings us into the long middle phase of the war. From about 1235 to 1257, you called it the War of Endurance. Goryeo really commits to this strategy of, well, not trying to win, just trying not to lose. Strategic non-conquest.
Exactly. This next phase, starting with the third invasion in 1235, was formally ordered by the great Khan himself, Ogedei. This followed major Mongol successes elsewhere, like the final conquest of the Jin dynasty. They were consolidating power. And as historian Remco Brucker points out, Goryeo seems to have fully learned the lessons from those first two invasions. They essentially stopped trying to field large conventional armies. Those just became targets for the Mongol cavalry and archers out on the plains.
So if they're not fighting big battles, what does this decentralized resistance actually look like? How did they fight back?
It relied on two core things, really, drawn from Goryeo's own history and geography. First, those mountain citadels we mentioned. Goryeo had this long tradition, especially from frontier warfare, of building networks of small, fortified camps high up in the mountains, often accessible only by steep, narrow paths.
Right, places where massed cavalry is useless.
Precisely. Mongol siege engines were hard to transport up there, their cavalry couldn't maneuver. Trying to individually assault hundreds of these small, well-defended fortresses was incredibly costly for the Mongols in terms of time and manpower. It caused significant attrition.
It seems like a perfect counter to the Mongol strengths, speed, maneuver, siegecraft. If the people and supplies are scattered in hard-to-reach places, the Mongol strategy just breaks down.
It really did nullify their main advantages, and the second element was the use of specialized military units, most notably the Sambiolcho. These started as the personal guard of the Cho dictators, but they evolved into Goryeo elite professional fighting force. They became the primary arm of this decentralized resistance. Highly mobile, they specialized in guerrilla tactics ambushes, raiding Mongol supply lines, hitting isolated Mongol detachments, then melting back into the hills or islands.
So the state, safe on Gangwon Island, effectively outsourced the mainland defense to these scattered mountain communities and these mobile Sambiolcho units.
That's a good way to put it. Maintain the central government structure on the island, while the mainland becomes this landscape of dispersed resistance. And it wasn't just military. There was a profound cultural and spiritual dimension, too.
You mean the Tripitaka Koreana, the woodblocks?
Yes, exactly. In 1237, King Gojong ordered the carving of the Goryeo Daijangyeong, this massive collection of Buddhist scriptures, onto over 80,000 woodblocks. It took until 1248 to complete. This wasn't just a religious act. It was explicitly intended as a way to invoke Buddha's protection for the nation, to spiritually unify the people against the invaders, a form of intangible resistance.
While all this fighting and carving is going on, Goryeo is also playing this incredibly risky diplomatic game with the Mongols, right? The whole hostage deception thing.
Oh, it was audacious. The Mongol court kept demanding the Goryeo king come in person to submit. King Gojong constantly stalled. He'd use excuses. He was too ill. He was too old. He was in a period of mourning. Anything to avoid going.
And then they took it a step further. They sent fakes.
They did. They sent two carefully selected substitutes. First, a relative named Chun, the Duke of Sinan, passed off as the king's own brother. Later, they sent a 17-year-old, a distant relative, Wang Sun, the Duke of Yunyong, pretending he was the crown prince.
And this actually worked. For how long? It seems incredible they could fool the Mongols.
Astonishingly, it worked for nearly 15 years. It bought Goryeo vital breathing space until around 1247.
How on earth did they pull that off? The Mongols were usually pretty meticulous about this stuff.
Goryeo got lucky, essentially. They benefited massively from the bigger geopolitical picture. The Mongols were hugely preoccupied elsewhere during much of this time. They were focused on the massive, difficult campaign against the Song dynasty in southern China. And crucially, after Egede Khan died in 1241, the Mongol Empire entered a long period of internal succession struggles. For almost a decade, the central Mongol leadership was too busy with power politics and campaigns way out west in Europe to really scrutinize the identity of a supposed prince from a relatively minor kingdom in the Far East.
So Goryeo basically slipped through the cracks during a period of Mongol distraction. Smart. But that look couldn't last forever.
No, because Goryeo still hadn't budged on the core demands. Move the capital back to the mainland and send the real royal heir. When Mongke Khan became Great Khan in 1251, things changed. Mongke was known for being much more systematic, much more focused on consolidating control. The demands on Goryeo became insistent and much more aggressive.
And that's when the invasions really ramped up in brutality, the later ones in the 1250s.
Exactly. The 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th invasions. These weren't really about conquering territory anymore. They seemed designed to break the kingdom's will through sheer terror and economic destruction. They targeted the civilian population directly, hoping the suffering on the mainland would force the regime on Gangwon Island to finally give in.
The sources describe the 5th and 6th invasions as particularly horrific. Can you give a sense of that?
Yeah, the accounts are grim. The 5th invasion in 1253 saw the siege of Cheongju. It lasted 70 days. The defenders were cut off, starving. And the sources record that rather than surrender to what they knew would be slaughter or enslavement, some of the inhabitants chose to burn themselves and their families alive inside the fortress. When the Mongols finally broke through, they massacred most who were left.
Just unimaginable desperation. And the 6th invasion, the sources mention huge numbers of captives.
The 6th in 1254 seems to have focused heavily on capturing people. One estimate cited in the sources suggests the Mongols took as many as 206,800 captives in that single campaign. For a kingdom the size of Goryeo, that's a catastrophic loss of population, of farmers, artisans, the productive base of the society.
200,000 people.
It's staggering, and the social fabric on the mainland was tearing apart. Famine was rampant. There are these harrowing reports mentioned of starvation being so bad that parents were apparently driven to abandon infants in the woods because they couldn't feed them or carry them while fleeing the Mongol raids. This level of brutality was strategic psychological warfare aimed squarely at the leadership hiding on Ganwa.
And around this time, the Mongols finally figured out the hostage deception, right?
Yes. Munka Khan eventually realized that the prince they'd been holding for years wasn't the real deal. The discovery of this deception just added fuel to the fire. The raids seemed to have become even more severe after 1255, intensifying the pressure dramatically.
So by the time we get to the 8th invasion in 1257, what was the situation in Goryeo?
Dire. Absolutely dire. Even on Ganwa Island, the supposedly safe capital, there was famine. Reports mention corpses lying unburied on the roads outside the city. Basic goods like rice were reportedly being paid for with silver, a sign of hyperinflation and desperation. Another delegation managed to negotiate a Mongol withdrawal, but the damage was done. The war of attrition had pushed Goryeo to the brink.
And crucially, it seems like that external pressure finally cracked the internal political structure. The end of the war didn't come from a final Mongol military victory, but from the collapse of the regime that had led the resistance.
Precisely. The Che military dictatorship, the architects of the Gangwa strategy, finally fell apart in 1258.
Let's track that fall. Cho was the one who made the move to Gangwon. His successor, Chohang, kept up the fight. But the last one, Choye, he seems to have really mismanaged things.
Yeah, Choi is portrayed very negatively. Arrogant, poor governance, especially given the suffering caused by the war. He reportedly refused famine relief to the commoners on the mainland, showing this real disconnect. But critically, for his own survival, he also alienated key figures within the military elite. He sidelined powerful generals, insulted people, particularly within those crucial Sambyulcho units that had been the backbone of the resistance.
So he lost support from both the people and the military. A fatal combination.
Absolutely. That alienation led directly to a coup. In 1258, a group of conspirators led by a general named Kim In-jun, who Choi had previously sidelined, stormed Choi's residence and killed him. Just like that, the military dictatorship that had ruled Goryeo for over half a century was over. Power was restored, nominally at least, to the Goryeo king.
But the new government was immediately split, wasn't it?
Instantly fractured. You basically had two main camps. On one side, the Confucian-oriented scholar officials and royalists, people like Yukiyoung and Chopcha, they argued passionately that the only way to save the kingdom now, to end the horrific suffering, was to submit fully to the Mongols. Peace at any price, essentially. On the other side, you still had remnants of the military faction, now led by the coup leader Kim In-jun. They still deeply disliked the idea of full submission, but even they had to admit that major concessions were unavoidable now. The kingdom couldn't take much more.
So it's a choice between formal submission to stop the pain or trying to continue a resistance that was bleeding the country dry. And then another blow came from the north.
Yes, the northeastern defection. This was critical. Local leaders up there, notably Cho Chi and Tuk Chung, basically decided they'd had enough of the Goryeo administration and the endless war. They rebelled against Goryeo, submitted directly to the Mongols, and helped the Mongols establish something called the Sangsung Prefecture in that territory.
So a part of Goryeo basically just broke off and joined the Mongols.
Effectively, yes. And it became a major base for Mongol operations, actively helping the Mongols attack other parts of Goryeo. It showed that for people on the periphery, peace under the Mongols was starting to look better than continued loyalty to a Goryeo government that couldn't protect them.
With the dictatorship gone, the government divided, and territory defecting, the path to peace, meaning submission, was pretty much set.
There really wasn't any other option left for the new royal government. The peace agreement was finalized in 1259, and Goryeo finally conceded on the two big sticking points the Mongols had demanded for decades.
Which were?
First, they agreed to send the actual crown prince, the future king Wanzhong, to the Mongol court as a genuine hostage. Second, they formally agreed to move the capital back from Gangwa Island to the old site at Gigyong, or Kaesong.
Sending the real heir was the ultimate act of submission, wasn't it? Even though moving the capital itself got delayed for quite a few more years. That moment in 1259 really marks the end of the active, state-led resistance.
It does. The fighting essentially stops, but it kicks off this new, very long chapter, 80 years, where Goryeo exists within the Mongol sphere of influence, a relationship that profoundly shaped the peninsula.
So let's look at the immediate aftermath first, the cost. The destruction must have been immense after nearly 40 years of war.
Unbelievable destruction. The sources are full of lament. There are claims that in large parts of the country, literally no wooden structures remained. Everything flammable had been burned during raids. This included huge cultural losses. The magnificent 9-story pagoda at Wanyangsa Temple, one of the wonders of the Silla kingdom that Goryeo inherited, was destroyed. And tragically, the first set of the Tripitaka Koreana woodblocks, the ones carved during an earlier conflict, were also lost to fire during one of the invasions. A huge blow to cultural heritage.
Yet, despite Goryeo essentially suing for peace after decades of defiance, the reception from the Mongols, specifically Kublai Khan, seems surprisingly positive, even respectful.
It's a fascinating reaction. When Kublai Khan, who was consolidating his power and about to found the Yuan dynasty, received the Goryeo crown prince, the sources say he was jubilant, and he made this very pointed remark. He noted that Goryeo was a kingdom that long ago even Tang Taizong personally campaigned against but was unable to defeat.
Peng Taizong being one of the most powerful emperors in Chinese history, who famously failed to conquer Goguryeo, Goryeo's predecessor state.
Exactly. So Kublai was framing Goryeo's voluntary political submission as this huge historical achievement for the Mongols. It was like saying, see? Even the mighty Tang couldn't do what we've done, brought this stubborn kingdom into our fold. It subtly elevated Goryeo's status. It wasn't just another crushed enemy. It was a prestigious, famously resistant kingdom that had finally acknowledged Mongol supremacy, almost as if by divine will.
But not everyone in Goryeo accepted this peace treaty, this submission. You mentioned the Sambiolcho earlier, those elite military units.
Right. The Sambiolcho, who had been fiercely loyal to the Chur military dictators and had done so much of the actual fighting, they saw this peace deal as a complete betrayal. They refused to accept the return of the capital to the mainland under Mongol oversight.
So they kept fighting.
They did. They launched a full-scale rebellion. They evacuated south, first to Jindo Island, then eventually to Jeju Island off the southern coast. There, they essentially set up an alternative Goryeo government in exile and continued armed resistance against both the Mongols and the new Goryeo royal government that had submitted.
How long did that last?
For about 3 years, until 1273. They were finally crushed by a large combined Mongol and Goryeo government naval force. But that Sambiolcho rebellion became this potent symbol of fighting spirit, a major point of national pride in later Korean history.
So after the rebellion was quashed, Goryeo settled into this long period, 80 years, as a vassal state of the Yuan dynasty. What did that actually mean in practice? Were they just a province?
Not quite a province. They maintained their own dynasty, their own king, their own internal administration, which was key to their survival as a distinct entity. But the subjugation was real. They were a compulsory ally, meaning Goryeo troops were often required to participate in Yuan military campaigns, including the disastrous invasions of Japan. The most significant link was through marriage. It became standard practice for Goryeo kings to marry Mongol princesses, daughters of the Yuan emperors. King Chunyel, the very prince who submitted, married one of Kublai Khan's daughters.
And this continued. There was Empress Gi later on, wasn't there?
Yes, perhaps the most famous example, Empress Ji, a Goryeo woman from a lower aristocratic background, ended up becoming one of the primary empresses of Tokhon Temür, the last major Yuan emperor. Their son even briefly became emperor of northern Yuan after the main dynasty fell in China. These marriage ties, while symbolic of subordination, actually gave the Goryeo kings a uniquely high status within the complex hierarchy of the Mongol Empire's vassal states. They were seen as more prestigious than many other conquered rulers, perhaps on par with groups like the Uyghurs who had allied early.
What about influence on day-to-day governance and culture?
Mongol influence was definitely felt. Those Daragachi, the Mongol overseers, remained present at the Goryeo court, often getting involved in internal politics, appointments, things like that. Mongol military garrisons were stationed in key areas, but culture flayed both ways. Because Goryeo was part of this vast, interconnected Mongol empire, Korean ideas, technologies, things like advancements in printing, maybe certain aspects of shipbuilding, even recipes for gunpowder could travel across Eurasia. And Mongol cultural influence came into Korea too. We see loanwords, styles of dress, customs.
And you mentioned linguistic traces surviving even today.
Yeah, particularly on Jeju Island. Because the Mongols maintained a large military presence there for a long time, partly to suppress the Sambiolcho, and later as a grazing area for horses. Quite a few Mongolian loanwords related to horses and military matters entered the local dialect and are apparently still used there today, a little linguistic fossil of that era.
So this long period of vassalage, while definitely involving foreign domination, was ultimately the price Goryeo paid for the survival of its dynasty and its identity. When did they finally break free?
The chance came when the Yuan dynasty itself started to crumble from within, mainly in the 1350s. Massive peasant rebellions in China, infighting among Mongol princes, economic collapse. The Yuan center couldn't hold. Goryeo, under a strong reformist king, King Gongmin, saw its opportunity. He began systematically pushing back. He attacked and destroyed the Mongol garrisons within Goryeo, launched campaigns northwards to reclaim the territories that had defected earlier, like that Sangsung prefecture.
So they managed to regain their full sovereignty.
Effectively, yes. By the late 1350s and 1360s, Goryeo had largely shaken off Mongol political control and reestablished its northern borders, essentially laying the groundwork for the territory of modern Korea. Their long endurance had paid off. They outlasted their overlords.
That timeline really highlights the strategy, doesn't it? The decades of resistance ensured something survived, a Korean political entity that was ready and able to reassert itself when the Mongol Empire weakened.
That's really the core argument many historians make. Goryeo was arguably never completely defeated militarily, never forced entirely to its knees by force of arms alone, the way many other states were. That combination of decentralized guerrilla war, the mountain strongholds, and crucially, that controversial but effective strategic retreat to Ganghwa by the Cho regime, it saved the dynasty from outright destruction. The final submission in 1259 was more of an internal political decision driven by exhaustion and the collapse of the military government, rather than a direct result of a final, crushing Mongol military victory.
The incredible story. The history of the Mongol invasions of Goryeo really is this powerful but also deeply difficult lesson in resilience, adaptation, and the sheer staggering cost of prolonged resistance. They fundamentally changed their society and how they fought just to survive a war they knew they couldn't win in a conventional sense.
Absolutely. And if we try to connect this all back to the bigger picture, it leaves us with a really profound and difficult question, doesn't it? One that kind of hangs over this whole period of history. Given the almost unbelievable cost, the hundreds of thousands taken captive, the economic ruin, the cultural treasures lost, followed by 80 years of foreign domination, was that stubborn, decades-long resistance ultimately worth it for Goryeo?
Or, put another way, did that very struggle, precisely because it prevented total conquest and the replacement of the Goryeo state structure, did that ultimately ensure the survival of a distinct Korean political identity? Did it allow them to endure until they could reclaim full sovereignty when the Yuan dynasty eventually fell?
It's a heavy question. Did the resistance buy survival at too high a price, or was the price necessary for survival itself?
Definitely something to mull over as you think about the different ways nations navigate existential threats and the long-term consequences of choosing resistance versus submission. A lot to consider there about strategic choices in history.